All right, let's talk about Israel. So you've probably seen massive rocket attacks going through, being launched on Israel, hundreds of rockets out of the Gaza Strip. A lot of violence within Israel and on the West Bank in Israel. I don't think it's being reported here in the U.S., but a lot of Israeli Arabs, unfortunately, citizens of Israel, young Israeli Arabs going out into the streets, harassing people, burning cars, dragging people out of their cars, beating them up. It's really, really ugly. In certain parts of Israel, people are being told to go home early, not to be driving out at night. And my sister yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I talked to her yesterday, she was in and out of the air raid shelter 7 times. So, with little kids running up and down the stairs, in and out of air raid shelters. I mean, it's a horrific situation. Now, last show I talked about some of the reasons why this is happening, but I want to flesh that out a little bit on a few fronts that I found interesting, and then I want to talk a little bit about Iron Dome, which is protecting Israel from these missiles. So, about 85 to 90% of the missiles launched are being shot down, which is truly amazing technology, because these are short-range missiles. These are not ballistic missiles where you have minutes or long periods of time to identify them, find them, and then shoot them down, and that's hard enough. And the United States is so afraid of the North Koreans because they have such ballistic missiles. You'd think that we'd have a system that could knock those things out. Iron Dome is a missile defense system that actually takes out very short-term projectiles that are in the air for very few minutes, and projectiles that are typically quite small. They don't have the size, and yet they're able to take them out. And part of it is the radar, the unique Israeli radar technology that makes it possible to identify not when the missile is in the air, but that nanosecond that it is launched. And therefore the response is immediate once it is launched, right? And, a variety, I don't know the technologies that go into it, but I think one of the things that is worth contemplating right now is, wow, I mean, the technology is truly stunning. The innovation that's involved, this is cutting edge. No other country in the world has this. The United States has, I think, tried to mimic or it's invested in this technology. So it owns, I think, part of the patent, if you will. I don't know if there's a patent, but basically they have some of that technology available to them, and it's going. Israel also has missile systems, 2 missile systems, the Arrow, and I forget the third one's name. And those missile systems are geared towards taking down ballistic missiles and mid-range missiles. So the kind of missiles Iran would send to Israel, they have missile defense system to take care of that, or the kind of missiles that Hezbollah has in the north that are more sophisticated than the ones Hamas has, but are still not ballistic. They're still in atmosphere, if you will. So a wide range of missiles. Israel, of course, was brutally attacked by the Iraqis in the 1990, no, not in the 91 war. Israel was attacked after 9/11 in the U.S. invasion, and with missiles all the way from Iraq, and part of the impetus for developing these anti-missile technologies came from that. Maybe it was the 91, George Bush Sr. War in Kuwait. I really, at this point, my mind's blanking. Anyways, I thought it would be worthwhile saying something, and I just did, I guess, about the Iron Dome system. It's deployed in southern Israel. It's deployed in northern Israel. Other missile systems, as I said, are deployed to protect Israel's cities and Israel's infrastructure from longer-range missiles, and that's the Persian Gulf War. That's right, in 91. So it's 91. Israel learned that it needed a missile defense system, the Scads, which are mid-range missiles, and Israel has built such a system, and it would behoove the Americans to use such a system, and instead of cowering and pretending the brutal dictator of North Korea is your best friend, maybe use a missile defense system to knock down a few of his missiles and show him how futile and pathetic they are, and maybe that would be a better way to deal with them. Not offensively, just defensively, just knock them onto the air every time they're launched. But no, we'd rather hug and kiss and pretend we're best friends. At least that was the strategy of the previous administration. So let's talk about what I think is interesting. It's an interesting issue. One of the reasons that Hamas and the Palestinians are claiming they had to go to war was this property dispute in Jerusalem. And what's interesting about this property dispute is you can read 20 different articles about it, and you get wide variety of points of view. I mean, the left basically views this as an example of Israeli apartheid. Apartheid is the separation of the races and the treatment of Arabs as second-class citizens. I mean, and there's a sense in which Arabs are one-and-a-half-class citizens, but they're certainly not second-class citizens. And the claim there is that basically these right-wing Israeli nationalists are insisting on occupying the homes of Arabs, and that the Israeli justice system is legitimizing this by basically evicting Arabs from property that they live in and handing it over to these far-right nationalist Jews. But it turns out, as in most cases, that this is much more complicated. It's a property rights question, and it's an interesting property rights question. It's a non-trivial property rights question, although I think the way this lays out, the answer is not that hard, just because of everything that's happened and everything that this process has gone through. So if you watch the news, if you read the newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal, I read the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal had an interpretation of this dispute, which was just nutty. Pro-Palestinian, didn't even grant the benefit of the doubt to the Israelis or the Israeli judicial system. Just crazy anti-Israeli, and this is the Wall Street Journal. I can just imagine what's in the New York Times and the Washington Post, not to mention European newspapers and European access. So let's go through this. We're talking about a neighborhood on the outskirts of Jerusalem, about a mile outside of the old city of Jerusalem, a neighborhood today called Sheikh Jarrah. A neighborhood that has symbolic value to both Jews and Muslims. There's a rabbi buried there from 3rd century BC, if you can believe that. They keep track of this stuff. And you know, some religious Jews like to go there and pray at his grave, the mystics that they are. And then there's some famous sheikh, important in Muslim history from the time of Saladin, so I don't know, 900 AD, also buried in this neighborhood. So it has some symbolic meaning for both Jews and Muslims for completely mystical reasons, but there you go. They both want this to one extent or another. So it turns out that in I had the date before. Anyway, in the late 19th century, I think it was 1878 or something like that, a group of Jews bought land in this neighborhood and bought it from its owners, and registered under the laws of the Ottoman Empire. Frank says Saladin was late 1100s, and you're absolutely right, of course. Time of the Crusades, so 900 would be way too early. So 1100, Saladin was around 1100. So this is 1100. I guess the Jews have it on the Arabs in terms of how old the claim is, right? Because or how old the mystical connection is. Anyway, during the Ottoman Empire, late 19th century, Jewish group, because of the fact that this was a burial site, bought this land and registered under the Ottoman Empire, right? And I guess Jews lived there, right? They took title of it in the 19th century, and they remained good through all different governments and regimes, although it is true that it looks like they failed to register it. They failed to register this title. Let me just find, is this the right one? Yes. Failed to register this title during the British occupation, or the British mandate, the mandate from the United Nations, or from the League of Nations originally. But it was assumed theirs throughout that period. And they had legal title found from the Ottoman Empire. Now, in 1948, of course, this part of Jerusalem was occupied by Jordan. So in the war of 1948, there was a split. The West Bank was occupied by the Jordanians. The Western Jerusalem, what's called Western Jerusalem, was occupied by the Israelis. And the Jordanians held this property as, there's a specific term for this, land owned by the enemy, basically, right? Land owned by the enemy. The current tenants of this land, the people who live on the land right now, were allowed in the 1950s to get a leasehold over this land. Right? So they were not owners, they were leaseholders. And they were granted this land, but under the assumption that the land was enemy land, right? There's a legal term for that, which unfortunately, enemy property it was called. Enemy property. So they handed it over to Jordan. Jordan at the time, by the way, basically expelled all the Jews from the territories that it occupied. The ones that were expelled were the lucky ones. The others were killed. And basically handed this leasehold onto them. In 1967, in the war, Six-Day War in 1967, Israel took this land from the Jordanians and basically annexed all of East Jerusalem and all of the surrounding land around Jerusalem to Israel, right? Let me just, I think this is the wrong article I'm looking at. And the Arab residents of these properties stayed on, right? And let me see. Yeah, that's too late. All right. So they basically stayed on until in several court rulings, they were recognized as leaseholders, and they were granted rights as renters on this land. So it was actually, in 1982, there was a settlement that basically said, where the occupants of this land recognized the fact that it was owned by some Israelis, they committed to paying rent on the land, on their living quarters. They committed to paying rent on it, and they basically signed a deal, recognizing that the actual title to the land belonged to these Israelis. Now, again, different conspiracy theories, different stories, different Arabs have come forward claiming that no, they bought it back in the Ottoman Empire, they bought it under the British mandate. All of those have been examined by the courts and found invalid. And indeed, the courts in Israel are pretty good at these kind of claims of property rights. Now, at some point, the Arab tenants stopped paying rent. Even though they never bought this property, It was clear that they rented it. It was only a question of who owned it, the Jordanians or these private Israelis. They stopped paying rent. And since then, the owners of the property have been trying to evict them. And it has been in court since then. And indeed, it goes from court case to court case and appeals. And this is a typical property rights dispute. And it's a property rights dispute infused with politics because the owners are Jewish and the tenants are Muslim Arabs. And this has been completely and utterly politicized. But there's nothing here other than a property dispute. Now, you can make all kinds of claims about Israeli courts don't treat property disputes equally when it's owned by Israelis, by Jews, and when it's owned by Muslims, and so on. And I'm open to any criticism of the Israeli court system for not upholding property rights. And, you know, I'm not a huge supporter of the Israeli government when it comes to property rights, when it comes to freedom, when it comes to economic freedom. Right? There are all kinds of problems. And there's no question that Israel in the past, and still does, I'm sure, does discriminate to some extent against its Arab population, against its Muslim population. But this is a great case where it doesn't seem like this is the case. This is just straightforward property rights. And property rights to which the tenants, the people who live in these homes, have acknowledged in an agreement in 1982. Indeed, this case was going in front of the Israeli Supreme Court. It's so complex because of all the different claims and because it was occupied territory by Jordan and now it was reoccupied, it was taken by Israel, and it's an Ottoman Empire deed. Does that count? When does it expire? When does occupancy of abandoned territory, but is it abandoned if it's occupied by military force that doesn't allow you to claim it? I mean, this is not trivial, right? And it went in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was about to announce a decision. And Hamas has used this as an excuse. They basically said, if you evict these people, it's all-out war. And given that the Supreme Court was about to announce, we don't know what they were going to announce, but they were about to announce something. They were about to announce their decision. They decided to launch, in a sense, a preemptive war in order to show politically their support for the Palestinian cause and how they're taking care of the Palestinians and how they're taking care of their interests and how they are so committed. And I'll get to why they want to do that right now in particular. But that's partly what this is all about. A property rights case that the left in the United States and around the world and Hamas and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and everybody else are taking as this big test of Israel as an apartheid state. No, Jews bought this. And if you don't recognize their property rights, you are discriminating against Jews, which is not new for Europeans and not new for Americans even, if you go back far enough. But to ask Israel to discriminate against its own people in a property rights case is bizarre. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of history there. There are a bunch of spins and turns in the process that I haven't really gone into. One of them being the fact that the ownership of the land, which is owned by, I'm not sure who, but it was the ownership land. The land was bought about 20 years ago, I think, or less, by a far-right nationalist group, which only makes this more political. Still doesn't change the essential property rights nature of the disputes. All right. Now, I also wanted to say a few things about some of the motivations for this attack. We talked about this a couple of days ago. but I think there's more to be said here. About a month, Mahmoud Abbas is the president in big quotes and whatever you want to call it, president of the Palestinian Authority. He's been president for 16 years, which is funny because when he was elected president, the last election, 16 years ago, he was elected for a term of 4 years. And yet, there have been no election since. And since there were no elections, he just stayed on as president. Just stayed on. 16th year of a 4-year term. He's 85 years old. He used to be Yasser Arafat's right-hand man. A terrorist in his own right. A bad man. A bad man. Nobody should be negotiating with this guy. Anyway, his legitimacy within the Palestinian territories was starting to be questioned. So he announced an election, and the election was supposed to be about a month ago. And as the election date got closer, he started getting really nervous because it really did appear that if the election was going to be held, he would, God forbid, lose. And lose to the Hamas, lose to the Islamists, not to some liberal, liberal in the positive sense, pro-liberty group within the Palestinians. No, lose to the authoritarian, religionist, Islamist, terrorists, Hamas. So he was worried about the election. The Americans were worried about the election. The Israelis were worried about the election. Nobody really wanted to have the election. So he found a convenient excuse to cancel the election. He said Israelis wouldn't let the Arab Palestinians vote who lived in Jerusalem. And the Israelis said, you can't vote in Jerusalem, but you can vote online, and you can drive drive 15 minutes and vote over there. You just can't vote in Jerusalem because Jerusalem is part of Israel. It's not part of the Palestinian Authority. He used that as an excuse to cancel the election. Now, of course, who did this upset? Well, this upset Hamas. So since the election has been canceled, Hamas and the Palestinian authorities have been at each other's throats. And since the election has been canceled, both parties are trying to show that they're tough on Israel, that they are the real defenders of the Palestinians, that they are better representatives of the Palestinians in the face of the Israelis, and therefore that Palestinians should support them. Both have been inciting violence on the West Bank, whether it's about the Al-Aqsa Mosque or whether it's about this residential buildings in this neighborhood. Both parties have been inciting violence left and right and escalating it. Now, granted, the Israelis don't know how to deal with it because, as I've said before, on the one hand, they don't know how to, on the one hand, they want to be fair and they want to be a rule of law country and they want to treat everybody well. On the other hand, they've got an enemy that's attacking them, but the enemy in Jerusalem, at least, is attacking them on Israeli territory, so they don't use the military, they use the police. They're overwhelmed, people get hurt. More than that, there's no question that Bibi Netanyahu has an interest to foment turmoil because he wants to make sure his opponents can't form a government. He might prefer to go to another fifth or sixth election in Israel because if there's turmoil, he thinks he might get more votes. So there's a lot of politics going on here. Of course, people on the ground are getting hurt, but there's a lot of politics going on here. And this has been going on for a month now. At a low level, it accelerated over the weekend, and Hamas decided that the Palestinian Authority, in a sense, was better represented on the ground, and they better show how good they are to the Palestinians so that they can keep their support. And they launched this barrage of rockets against Israel. So even when it comes to Hamas, this is not they're going to war because they think they can win and this is their big opportunity to win and destroy. They know they can't win. They know this is a disaster. But for them, this is an opportunity to win the political battle within the Palestinian community. It's an opportunity for them to show that they're tough, that they'll stand up to Israel, that they'll fight. They'll stand up for the so-called rights of the Palestinian people. So, Israel, the only solution to this is for Israel to get tough, really tough. The only solution for this is for Israel to use its military to crush the Palestinians, including the Gaza and the Gaza Strip, and to deny them any semblance of hope, any semblance of thought that they could defeat Israel, reoccupy it, take control of the educational institutions, take control of the political institutions, give it 20 to 30 years, hope that under those kind of circumstances, crushing them, defeating them, taking away all hope, and then engaged in education in not converting them to Judaism or anything, but just education in values, in Western values and the values of individualism and the values of freedom, that they can change the culture, and then I think you have the solution. Then you can have a two-state solution, a three-state solution, a one-state solution. At that point, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But there's no other thing. But they can't do it. They can't do it because they don't have the moral confidence. They can't do it because they believe it's their duty to sacrifice. So they live in this middle space where they don't actually die, but they can't do what's necessary to live. So they live under a condition of, horror. A condition of constant threat. And they can't do it because the United States would oppose them, would condemn them, would restrain them, would restrict them, would tie their hands.
And to begin with, I wonder if I can ask you to capsulize, I know this is difficult, can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute. That man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it. And that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, a morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
All right, all right.
Now, may I define what my morality is?
All right.
Because this is merely an introduction. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people, nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
May I?
All right, before we go on, reminder, please like the show. We've got 163 live listeners right now, 30 likes, that should be at least 100. I figure at least 100 of you actually like the show. Maybe there are like 60 of the Matthews out there who hate it, but at least the people who are liking it, you know, I want to see a thumbs up. There you go. Start liking it. I want to see that go to 100. All it takes is a click of a thing. Whether you're looking at this, and you know, the likes matter. It's not an issue of my ego. It's an issue of the algorithm. The more you like something, the more the algorithm likes it. So, you know, and if you don't like the show, give it a thumbs down. Let's see your actual views being reflected in the likes. But if you like it, don't just sit there. Help get the show promoted. Of course, you should also share, and you can support the show at JeronBrooksShow.com/support, or on Patreon or Subscribestar or Locals. And show your support for the work, for the value hopefully you're receiving from this. And of course, don't forget, if you're not a subscriber, even if you just come here to troll, or even if you're here like Matthew to defend Marx, then you should subscribe, because that way you'll know when to show up. You'll know what shows are on, when they're on. You'll get notified, right? So yes, like, share, subscribe, support. Like, share, subscribe, support. There you go. Easy. Do one or all of those, please.